the Cipher Brief. I'm Tom Nagorski. Good to have you with us. I'm with Kurt Volker, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, on the eve of a major summit for the NATO alliance. The alliance celebrating this year its 75th anniversary. Ambassador Volker, it's great to have you with us. And there's a ton, as you know more than most, on the agenda. There always is. But I want to start with Ukraine, and not necessarily the war itself, but we have heard even before February 2022, of course, about the prospects of NATO, of Ukraine having some greater relationship with NATO. And I'd like to begin there with a fundamental question. What do you think will be the alliance's offer for Ukraine next week, if there is one, in answer to that question? And what do you think should be the NATO answer to Ukraine when they come asking that question?
Well, Tom, it's great to be with you, and thanks for that. Let's just go right into your question, although I want to make sure we come back to NATO more broadly as well. But on the Ukraine issue, what is likely to happen is a repeat of the language from Vilnius, although dressed up in some way, which is in itself a version of the language from Bucharest in 2008. So for 16 years, we've been saying to Ukraine, you will be a member of NATO someday, but we're not taking any steps to get you there. And that is likely to be the upshot of what the membership conversation is. Now, there will be a few other things for Ukraine. Up until now, there has been no NATO role in helping Ukraine whatsoever. Everything has been done by individual allies, individual countries. Even the assistance coordination that has been done to coordinate military aid to Ukraine has been done outside of NATO in this so-called Ramstein process that the US has led. And so this will be the first time now that NATO is being given a role in helping Ukraine. And that's going to be likely taking over this Ramstein process, giving it a new NATO label, looking roughly the same as it did until now, but giving it a NATO label. Also looking a little bit longer term at helping Ukraine develop its defense industrial production, access to defense industry, defense procurement assistance, building the future Ukrainian force. How is Ukraine's military going to look 5 years, 10 years from now? That sort of thing will be done for Ukraine as well. But what's really striking is we are in the midst of the biggest war in Europe since World War II. NATO's job is peace and security in Europe. And here we are, in my view, kind of minimizing what we do for Ukraine and minimizing the way we talk about this war as a NATO issue, and instead taking these marginal steps that don't really address the elephant in the room.
Okay, well, let's pick up right there then. I was going to ask you something else, but what do you think would be the more robust response or answer to the Ukrainian question, which, as you say, has Bucharest, Vilnius, et cetera, it's been asked for a long time?
Yeah. So I think the way to answer that question is to ask, what is the message that we want the NATO summit to convey to Vladimir Putin? Mm-hmm. Do we want Putin to understand that his war in Europe, his ideology of fascism, genocide, imperialism, is a relic of the past? We will never allow this to succeed in Europe. And the more he tries, the more he will only hurt Russia. Ukraine will be a successful European democracy, a member of the EU, a member of NATO, and his efforts to disrupt that will never succeed. That is the message we want him to get. Mm-hmm. To convey that message, we should be joining what the EU is doing. The EU has recently opened accession negotiations with Ukraine, and they are sending this long-term message to Putin. NATO should be doing the same thing. NATO should be opening accession talks with Ukraine. True, we've never done this before. We've always just said you're in or you're out, but we can create a process if we want to. Mm-hmm. We can say, we're starting the talks now. We're going to move you in as quickly as we can. We're going to start talking about how to go about your defense in the NATO-Ukraine Council, or you can join us at the North Atlantic Council, just out of alphabetical order. You could be with us there. But we should be sending signals to Putin that this train is moving and he will never win. Instead, by ducking the issue yet again, we're sending a signal that we lack the resolve. And that is just an invitation to Putin to continue the war.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you cast this as a message next week for Vladimir Putin. In your view, then, not that one has to choose one or the others, is almost more important than the message to Zelensky himself?
Yeah, I would agree. I would say yes, because Putin is the one who has launched this war, is attacking Ukraine, has vowed to change out the government in Kyiv, that has said publicly many times that Ukraine is not a legitimate country. It was a gift to the Soviet Union, and that these are Russian lands, and that he has a right to take them over, and that Ukrainian people, culture, nationality, identity don't really exist. So that is the danger that we face in Europe, this ideology, very similar to the ideology Hitler had about a master race and about the right to take over other countries like Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland. So we've got to disabuse Putin of that. So the message has got to be to him. Ultimately, if you think about NATO, NATO's job, number one, of course, is to protect its current members. But if we are facing the prospect of a wider war based on Putin's ideology, we're not doing enough to protect our members if we let this war keep going. We've got to see this stopped in Ukraine so it doesn't spread elsewhere.
So you've led right to my next question, Ambassador Volker, which is we hear regularly, we heard it from Joe Biden recently, but we hear from NATO members in Europe in particular that the point you just made, that the other countries in Europe, take your pick, the Baltics are always in that conversation, are at risk if Putin is not stopped. So you have done it already, but assess, what's your assessment of that statement? There are some who feel that it's overblown and it's a way to make the case for more aid. Do you think that Vladimir Putin has his sights set on, pick your nation, west of Ukraine or north or what have you?
Well, back in 1938 and 39, people thought it was overblown to suggest that Hitler was going to take over Austria, or that he was going to take the Sudetenland, or if he took the Sudetenland, that he would be happy to stop there and not try to take all of Czechoslovakia. Or that once he took Czechoslovakia, that would be it. They certainly wouldn't attack Poland. And he did all of those things because he faced no resistance. And that is the kind of situation we face with Putin now. He is not facing sufficient resistance in Ukraine. And if he succeeds in Ukraine, consolidates his gains, topples the government, you can be sure that he will be looking at other territories that used to be part of the Soviet Union and used to be part of the Russian Empire that he believes should rightfully belong to Russia, and he'll be angling to take them back again. So take the Baltic states, for example. You mentioned them. They were occupied by the Soviet Union from the period of World War II until 1991. They got their independence back 23 years ago, and they are rightfully terrified that a Putin unchecked will want to bring them back under Russian tutelage. Finland was also called a Baltic state before the 1920s. It was also part of the Russian Empire, and Putin could make the same argument. You also have a piece of territory that belongs to Russia, used to belong to Prussia. It was Königsberg, now it's called Kaliningrad. And there is no land connection between Kaliningrad and the rest of Russia. So Putin would make a claim that, well, surely Russia needs to have a land corridor to connect it to Kaliningrad. Well, that land corridor can only go through Lithuania or Poland or both. There is no other way. So that would be a claim against NATO territory there. So I have no doubt that Putin is serious when he makes these kinds of claims. Remember, before he launched his full-scale invasion, he gave NATO an ultimatum that included withdrawing NATO membership from the Baltic states and from Poland, surely with an eye toward taking these lands at some point in the future.
Yep. So you used the phrase elephant in the room a moment ago. I'm going to use it in a different context now. I'm assuming that the U.S. presidential election is not a formal agenda item at the summit next week, but it's certainly in the conversation even before the recent debate. And I wonder, well, first of all, you, with all the connections and contacts and friends and colleagues you must have in Europe, I am curious, if you don't mind my asking without betraying confidence.
Mhm.
I imagine that your phone or your inbox is lighting up with questions about, just what's going on here and just a general level of concern. So, first of all, how concerned are your friends in Europe about what's happening here and what may happen on November 5th? And what do you
Yeah.
tell them?
Yeah. Everybody is concerned, but not all in the same way.
Right.
And I spent most of May and June traveling in Europe. I was in Berlin and London. I was at several international conferences that had lots of other West Europeans present. I was also in Ukraine, in Odessa, in southwestern Ukraine, in Izmail. I was in Poland. I was in Estonia and Georgia. And so you get very different vibes depending on who you talk to. The West Europeans freak out about Donald Trump. They don't like him as a person. They don't like his personality. They don't like his vulgarity. They don't like the threats that he makes about not supporting NATO allies. They didn't like his tariffs. They didn't like his threats against the automobile industry in Germany. You name it. They have anxieties about Donald Trump, and they express them constantly. And my advice to my West European friends is always don't make any assumptions. You don't know what the policies are going to be. Do your own homework. Spend 2% of GDP on defense. Prepare your forces. Build your defense industry. Do your own homework, and then be proactive. Suggest to the U.S. and to NATO what we should be doing together. Don't wait for something to happen and then complain about it. So that's the West Europe side. Ukrainians are very different. The Ukrainians look at the last 2 years and say that this was incredibly frustrating. Never enough support, always too little, always too late, always too much lecturing, even now still facing restrictions on the use of US weapons that we provide, as we tell them, don't hit deep inside Russia, even though Russia's hitting you. This is something Ukrainians are incredibly frustrated with. And so they look at the prospect of a new Biden administration with a great deal of trepidation because they say it's going to be 4 more years of slow death in that case. Never enough, never full support. And they remember that it was Trump who wanted to shut down Nord Stream 2, who provided the first security assistance to Ukraine, the Javelins, back in 2017. And so they're happy to roll the dice with Trump because they imagine the U.S. wants to be in a stronger position, and they see a weak position right now, and Putin only just taking advantage of that. Central and East Europeans, Poles, Balts, they're somewhat closer to the Ukrainian point of view, but they're worried on both ends. They're worried about what if we have 4 more years of weakness? What if that then also engenders weakness from France and Germany? Another year of Scholz in Berlin and the Front National now in government in France, perhaps. So they worry about weakness all around. But then they also worry about Trump because what they read into Trump's statements about ending the war in 24 hours is just pulling the rug out from under Ukraine, telling them to give up territory, telling them that we're not going to support them anymore. And they would be very afraid of that because that would give Putin just the kind of encouragement that they don't want him to feel because it could lead to attacks against their own states.
So, Ambassador, you mentioned the size of NATO having changed, and some of that, the sort of founding principles altered a bit along the way. But the remit and the agenda also strike me as so. I mean, of course, one can't have imagined all those years ago that cybersecurity would be something to talk about, or artificial intelligence, or for that matter, a new powerful China. Do you think that NATO, in that sense, is spreading its wings too far, or is it appropriate for NATO to be taking all that stuff up?
Well, it's a great question because in some ways, the nature of the threat, of course, has changed dramatically. We went through a period where we were worried about regional instability, wars in the Balkans. Went through a period where we were worried about terrorism. And now we're going through a period where we're worried about very unconventional sorts of threats, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, undermining our electoral democracies, and so forth. So I think in that respect, we have to actually look at the alliance as the right venue for dealing with an aggressor in Europe, particularly Russia, that is using new tactics, but still for old purposes of defeating our societies. So in that respect, I think NATO is right on. Maybe it even needs to do more. I would argue that we are facing significant enough hybrid attacks in NATO territory already today that it warrants some Article 4 consultations among allies about what's happening and what we should do about it. Targeted assassinations on our own territory, sabotage, arson, vandalism of national symbols, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, bribery and funding of political parties in order to undermine political institutions. This is all serious and it's all happening. So we should be talking about that. Now, when you then bring up China and say, well, maybe that is a little bit farther afield for NATO. China is interested mainly in territorial gains in the South China Sea, not really territorial gains against Europe. On the other hand, we see China much more active in Europe, doing things like trying to scoop up digital information, influence societies, and fundamentally advantage China economically, even in Europe, by doing things like buying up significant percentages of all the major European ports and then providing a network that pipes in cheap Chinese goods to undermine European goods. So we do have to talk about this, but I think the Chinese threat is somewhat different still than the nature of the threat that we face from Russia. And I think NATO should be looking at the threat from Russia in all its dimensions.